imagination is infinite, and he also brings in the spins of theological and Christian themes in the imagination, which was not there in Kant's theory. And also that fancy is lesser than imagination. It is a fragmentary images. Fancy is fragmentary images, whereas imagination is vital. So
Yeah.
that is where we left
Apart
off.
from that, what else does anyone remember apart from this? What else? You are right, Saloni, you are what you said. So apart from what Saloni said, does anyone remember? Who remembers something? Yeah, Shatabdi. Actually, Shatabdi said something. Okay. Yeah, so who remembers something else apart from what Shatabdi has said? Right? He sees Kantian idea of transcendental reason as reason of God, right? Which provides you universal knowledge. So you can see how he has a different take on God. While Kant's God is in noumena, uh, Coleridge's God is actually somebody who uses this transcendental reason. Correct. What else? Primary and secondary characteristics of imagination. So can you add to it, Jay?
So he said that the imagination is divided into two specific characteristics. First is the primary characteristic, in which whatever we imagine is the echo of the universe or the divine.
Okay.
And in the secondary characteristic, we tend to make a bridge from the divine to the I mean, to our instincts or to our senses.
No, not exactly. Primary imagination is imagination that is integral to understanding, which Kant pointed out, right? Understanding provides concepts, imagination provides forms, and sensibility provides the sensory data. That's what Kant's uh, theory said, right? So that is the primary imagination with a metaphysical spin on it. There is a metaphysical take on it. And that is that this primary imagination is a kind of echo of the imagination of God. I will just yeah. So the primary imagination is an echo of the creative act of God, right? That is the eternal creation in infinite I am. That is the being of God, in which God created world out of nothing, ex nihilo, from the word or the logos. That's the biblical theme. So primary imagination is something which everybody has. It is something by which you recognize this pen as the pen, right? Secondary imagination is something that is distinctive to creative writers. It's a creative writers or artists faculty. And it has power to be assemblastic. That means to fuse things together and create a totality, organic whole. That's the power of secondary imagination, which is not different entirely from primary, but it differs in degree and in the mode, the manner in which it works. Right.
He and he
Yeah.
also differentiated between fancy and imagination.
So what's that difference?
Fancy is something that we tend to daydream, like that doesn't affect our real life and day-to-day life, and the imagination can affect our art or it can affect our day-to-day life.
Jack, imagination produces art, right? And
Yeah,
fancy can only produce fragmented pictures based on our memory, like our fantasy. Right? It's not that it cannot influence our life. That is not the point here. These are two different ways of imagining.
yes.
So fancy is a fragmentary nature of imagination, right? It is in fragmentary and it is in fixities. It does not dissolve, dissipates and diffuse in order to create a unity. It does not have that assemblastic power, right? And that's why all of us do fantasize, but not all of us are writers, right?
Yeah.
So a person like Tolkien would create this whole world in Lord of the Rings trilogy, right? Made from different kind of sources like mythology, Norse mythology, and so on and so forth. Or J.K. Rowling can create the entire world of Harry Potter, right? Now these worlds that you find are holistic and complete, and they are products of secondary imagination. So he's also pointing out that how everybody may fantasize, but that doesn't make everybody a writer or an artist. Clear?
Yes, sir, clear.
Okay, what else?
And also at the beginning,
Yeah.
we saw how Coleridge was influenced by French Revolution, and then how he sees rationality. He finds problem with the rationality and abstract thinking of Rousseau and Locke, the French philosophers. And then he thinks it makes it more mechanical. So from that way we see how romanticism came into being, like it is a reaction against that.
Right.
And so his own poetry are a rejection of the heroic couplet and neoclassicism. We also discussed about that briefly.
What Asma has also pointed out, right?
So,
Right. So French Revolution, influenced by Rousseau and Locke, Hume, and others, would emphasize rationality as a kind of abstract principle on which you can base your ideas of state. And according to Coleridge, that is possible only when you are thinking of state or society as a machine which you produce through your scientific rationality. And that's not possible. And it actually hinders the natural growth of society. So you can say he's taking a very conservative position on French Revolution, right? And the principles of French Revolution. So the person who started out as a great supporter of French Revolution would find himself turning into a very deep conservative like Edmund Burke. And this conservatism is the cornerstone of Coleridge's thought, political thought, and the later political thought that influenced people. So Coleridge was also an influential political thinker, right? His conservatism, like Edmund Burke's, influenced the British writers. Very good. Right. Anything else that we discussed? Does anyone remember? Okay. So let's look at another extremely important issue in Coleridge. Right. We have seen his theory of imagination and how it is derived from Kant, but it's very different. We have also seen his political conservatism, right? And his criticism of Enlightenment rationality. And that is seen in his theory of imagination, because imagination is something that is much more powerful than something which assists understanding, according to Kantian theory of imagination, right? So he goes beyond Kantian theory of imagination and introduces theology and metaphysics in a big way in his own theory of imagination and fancy. Another very important point in Coleridge, and this is what actually brought him in tension with his close friend William Wordsworth, is about the language of poetry. And very importantly, Coleridge's theory of language of poetry and creative process as such anticipates a lot of important theoretical developments in literary criticism up to 1960s, at least 1940s. It found its expression even in something called new criticism, which is not the latest criticism. New criticism is the American school of formalism, which began somewhere in 1920s and ended by 1950s or so, late 50s. So it is something that is almost done by 1960s. So new criticism is not to be confused with latest criticism, right? So that brings us to the idea of how new is a relative term. So जिसे हम new criticism कहते हैं, वो actually 1920s से लेकर 60s तक की एक movement है, American literary criticism की, which we will discuss if time permits. And actually my aim is to actually reach up to there, and that is why these extra classes. But Coleridge anticipates their ideas. He also anticipates ideas of Russian formalism, which is a Russian counterpart to formalism. And you can see that formalism seems to have its basis in Kant. And I don't know how many of you remember that. I did point out how Kantian philosophy is in some way one of the pioneering philosophies of formalism. Does anyone remember? याद है किसी का या भूल गए? है किसी को याद? Okay. In case you don't remember, what Kant said about art is that art is something that does not really enter the conceptual domain, right? Sensibility gives sensory data, and imagination gives it a form. But this form does not get subsumed under category of beautiful, right? Because there is no such universal category of beautiful. So what happens that such a category has to be invented. Now, if it does not go into the existing category of beautiful, it goes into the emotional cell. Let me take you back to that chart so you may remember that idea. कितने लोगों को याद है पता नहीं. Okay. So I'm now sharing the screen. Can you see this chart once again? Can you see this chart? No. Can you see the Word file?
Yes, sir, we can.
Yeah. So this is the Kantian schema of and work of art, right, is given certain reaches our sensory domain, that is our sensibility, and imagination makes a form out of it. But instead of going to understanding and concepts, it goes to emotional self, right? It goes to the emotional part of your existence, right? And that gives rise to an emotional response. Now, this emotional response is there in everyone. Everybody responds to art. And that's why he calls it subjective universal. It is subjective because it does not have any universal category. But at the same time, it is universal because everybody has this kind of ability to respond to a work of art. Right? So what is happening is that this form becomes the most important aspect of his thought, aesthetic thought. Right? Form is something that is produced by imagination, and concept or its content is not all that important. It is not important in aesthetic experience. It is the form that is central, that is produced by uh, imagination, that occupies the most important place in Kantian aesthetics. Remember that? याद आ रहा है किसी को? And that's why aesthetic is the domain which is autonomous from philosophy as well as from ethics. Remember this conversation, याद आ रहा है किसी को? अभी भी नहीं आ रहा है, भूल गए सब कुछ. So that tells you how you should be reading at all the times parallelly to the discussion. वरना तो आप तुरंत ही भूल जाओगे क्लास में क्या डिस्कस किया है. At the time of exams, you will be clueless. So you should be reading parallelly as we go on discussing. Classrooms are not meant to substitute reading, but to complement your reading, right? So classrooms are meant to help you read. Remember that. And if you're not doing that, then you are likely to forget whatever we discuss in the class. So Kantian theory in that sense is formalistic because it gives central importance to form rather than the concept or the content. Right? So it is the form that is central to aesthetic experience, and it is imagination rather than understanding that produces aesthetic experience. Right? And that is why it is also, art is also autonomous. So what Coleridge talks about is something else. His quarrel starts with his quarrel with his friend Wordsworth over language of poetry. And Wordsworth said that poetry is not fundamentally different from prose. Right? Poetry and prose are mostly the same. So it is only difference is that of meter. So if meter add कर दो prose पे तो poetry हो गई. So that is one important idea that you find in Wordsworth. Wordsworth does not make a difference between ordinary everyday language and the language of literature or poetry. For Wordsworth, they are both the same. Coleridge, on the other hand, makes a distinction between language of poetry and language of prose. Language of prose is basically meant for communicating truth, right? That is what at least it was believed in the West, that it seems to be basically about communicating truth. Coleridge says that language of poetry is also about communicating truth, but it's like a goal or a destination you have to reach. Truth is the destination you have to reach, and what creates pleasure is the journey itself. Now, what does it mean? Can anyone explain this to me? He says that pleasure is primary in poetic language, right? Though poetry also communicates truth, that truth is like the destination. But you don't travel for destinations, you travel to enjoy the journey. And poetic language is that journey, experience of the journey where you arrive at the truth. So for him, that is what is source of pleasure, and that is primary. While in prose, it's truth that is primary. In language of poetry, it is pleasure that is primary. So can one explain me what do you mean by that? It's the journey. So it's there on page number 451. First
Sir,
paragraph. Yeah.
is the term art for art's sake relevant here? Because
Yes.
even there we discuss the pleasure of art, and the moral component may or may not be included in it.
Exactly. And that's why it is aesthetic and formalistic theory of literature. And art for art's sake is the end 19th century movement, almost 50 years after Coleridge, right? And the leaders were Walter Pater and Oscar Wilde. These were the main proponents of art for art's sake movement. But the ideas you find in English for first time being articulated theoretically by Coleridge. And in German, the most important articulation is in Kant. Right? Clear? So tell me what do you mean by this 451 page number? That truth is not merely reaching the goal, but the attraction of the journey itself. And it's the journey that by which you reach the truth, which is the source of pleasure in poetic use of language. So poetic use of language for Coleridge is essentially different. Yeah, Jay, go ahead.
Sir, I think he is talking about the experience of senses. He's talking about the knowing of truth through the senses.
Yes, and the pleasure that you get by traveling to a place, right? The journey itself is fun. It's not about reaching the station. That is prose. But if you travel to enjoy the journey, it is poetry. If you travel to go reach a destination, it is prose. Now, in both the cases, you reach the destination called truth, right? But your attitudes differ and the intentions differ, right? So that is his major argument, that, and it resembles the distinction that later I. Richards would make between referential use of language and emotive use of language. In the beginning of 20th century, almost 70, 80 years after Coleridge, he would say that referential use of language is found in science, where you are trying to communicate the meaning. You refer to certain things. But language of literature is emotive. Its intention primarily is to communicate or evoke or create emotions rather than refer to objects. Right? So if you say sun rises in the east, it is referential use of language. But if you say sun rises in the west, that is poetic use of language, right? Does that make any sense?
Yes, sir.
So this distinction between the ordinary everyday language or language of science and language of poetry or literature as being different is the cornerstone of formalist thought. Right? Formalism relies upon this distinction. And you can see why it is formalist. It is formalist because what you say is not important. How you say is important. Right? Traveling from here to Ahmedabad, right? But if you are, say, I just want to go in my own way and reach Ahmedabad, मैं कहीं बाजू में निकल जाऊंगा, घूमता फिरता जंगल झाड़ी में कहीं पे घूम के फिर के बाद में आई विल रीच अहमदाबाद, बिकॉज रीचिंग अहमदाबाद इज नॉट माई प्राइमरी टारगेट. I want to go around sightseeing and enjoying in my own way. So that's a different mode of travel. So literary language is like that. It's a different mode of travel, right? Unlike the language of prose or language of everyday communication. That this everyday communication is content. जहाँ पे आपको जो कहना है वो important होता है, content important होता है. You go to canteen and say give me 2 sandwiches, right? Your primary task is to convey the information. But if you go to canteen just to enjoy with your friends instead of eating, enjoy ambience, joking, and food is not all that important, then it's more of a form that is more important than content, right? And that allows Coleridge to make a distinction between how in literature fictionality functions, fictionality being one of the important aspects. And he very famously gives definition of poetic faith, again page 451, as willing suspension of disbelief, right? When you want to hear news, you are not sitting there to basically suspend your disbelief. But when you go to watch a film and you see the superheroes, then you are willing to suspend your disbelief. What do you understand by that? Poetic faith is your willingness to suspend your disbelief. What does that mean? Can anyone tell me?
It is when we want pleasure from it and we keep the reason aside.
And we are willing, we don't ask, ये आदमी उड़ कैसे गया, right?
Yes.
Ask that question. But if you are listening to news and newsreader flies away, then you are in disbelief, right? You can't believe it. किसी नेता का इंटरव्यू चल रहा है और नेता उड़ गया, तब आप क्या करोगे? You will express your disbelief. But when you go to watch superhero films, then well, they fly. So you're willingly suspending your skepticism or doubt or disbelief when you watch fictionality. So basically, artistic expression is different from everyday conversational experience, conversational expressions, right? So this distinction is at heart of formalism, and the idea of autonomy of art is also found here. And it again connects to Hegel as well, who also supported art as a form of freedom from moralistic and philosophical preoccupation. And if you go back to classical paradigm, then Horace talks about delight and instruct, right? But here it is, instruction becomes not only subsidiary, almost irrelevant. Delight becomes primary. So Kubla Khan's poem is not about it's not basically about giving you information about Kubla Khan. It's not a history lesson, right? Yes, no. And there is a moral in rhyme to the rhyme of the ancient mariner, right? You have read that. So what is the moral of rhyme of the ancient mariner? Who remembers? कोई नहीं. You've forgotten.
So I don't remember exactly, but I think he kills the bird or something, something like that, and then he regrets it.
Kills Coleridge.
No,
No,
no, the
Mariner.
character.
Mariner, right? Ancient mariner. He kills which bird?
Albatross.
Albatross. And what is the moral of it? सीख क्या मिलती है? कब पढ़ा ये आपने? और इस सेमेस्टर में? Yeah, Shatabdi, when did you study this film?
So 10th standard.
Not in this semester?
No.
Just
No,
school days.
sir.
School
Yes.
days. Okay.
Yes, sir.
मगर जो कुछ उसमें सीख थी वो इम्पोर्टेंट नहीं थी क्या? सीख क्या थी? that you should not kill nature's gift, right? Nature has sent this albatross and you shouldn't be killing it. Now you write 4 to 5 pages of a poem just to tell people not to kill birds. Now how does that sound? पहली लाइन में लिख दो ना कि birds भगवान की देन होती है, birds, you shouldn't be killing them. It is one line moral, right? So the destination is very obvious, and that is not the reason why we read poem for. We read poem for enjoying the rhymes and internal rhymes and the imagery and symbolism of the poem, right? For example, his ship gets stranded in middle of the sea, and water everywhere and not a drop to drink. And then he sees all the beings in the sea, all the creatures which he describes. So there are descriptions and internal rhymes and of ballad feet. So you enjoy this journey rather than just reaching an obvious kind of moral, right? That is what he's trying to tell you with this. And yeah, just a minute. Yeah. So the whole journey that you engage in enjoying, imagining, visioning the whole story is what is more important than the moral, right? So moral in itself does not give pleasure, right? It is the journey, and this journey is the form. And classical Sanskrit poetics would use words like vakrokti, यानी सीधे सीधे नहीं बोलना, टेढ़ा बोलना, घुमा फिरा के बोलना. क्यों? Because that is the source of pleasure according to the formalist aesthetic theory, right? And that's why he again enters into a kind of quarrel with Wordsworth, who said that poetry should be written in the language of men, really used by men. And means rustic, uneducated people. Because for him, that is the real language. Do you remember that? Real language. Poet is a man talking to men. And the language is language really used by men. Now, Coleridge has two problems with these ideas. First problem is, what do you mean by really used by men? Right? Really used by men would very often mean that everybody uses that language. And is there anything like real language? Because Coleridge would say, my own language is different from Wordsworth's language, right? And Mansi's language is different from Jay's language, is different from Asma's language, is different from Smith's language. So language, real ऐसी कोई होती नहीं. It varies from person to person, and place to place, and class to class, and caste to class, right? So there is no such thing like real language. So he is almost attacking Wordsworth, his best friend, on this point. The another problem that he has, that rustic language is not essentially a higher form of language, right? Because it lacks substantial amount of vocabulary, and it does not lack. It also lacks certain kind of philosophical reflexivity, which a poem demands. A poem demands that the poet should have certain kind of depth of perception, higher imagination. Your secondary imagination should be developed, and you should have certain philosophical depth as well, which the uneducated person may not have. So that is his second problem with Wordsworth. Let's now look at his very famous description of creative writing on page number 451. And I will stop, right? Page 451, Coleridge says, what is the model, the ideal model of creative writing? The poet, described in an ideal perfection, brings the whole soul of man into activity. It is not just intellect, it's not just emotion, it's not just unconscious, it's not just feelings, it's not just visions, but the whole soul of man into activity, with subordination of its faculties to each other according to their relative worth and dignity. He diffuses a tone and spirit of unity that blends, as it were, fuses, remember, secondary imagination, each into each by that synthetic and magical power, which is what? Imagination, to which we have exclusively appropriated the name of imagination. This power, first put in action by the will and understanding and retained under their irremissive, though gentle and unnoticed control, reveals itself in balance or reconciliation of opposite or discordant qualities, of sameness with difference, of the general with the concrete, of the idea with the image, the individual with the representative, the sense of novelty and freshness with old and familiar objects, a more than usual state of emotion, with a more than usual order, judgment ever awake and steady self-possession, with enthusiasm and feeling profound or vehement, and it blends and harmonizes the natural and the artificial, still subordinates art to nature, the manner to the matter, and our admiration to the poet, to our sympathy with the poetry. ये जो 5 मिनट मैंने पढ़ा ना, वो एक ही सेंटेंस था, right? So you can see how long sentences are used here. But it's worth going over this passage carefully, right? It's the entire being of man that is put into action, and through the symplastic or fusing power of imagination. And it brings about reconciliation, means of opposite qualities, goodness and bad, whatever opposites, and poetry. And that's why new critics, again the American critics of 1930s and 50s, would call it language of paradox or language of wit. Poetry is a language of paradox because it brings together opposites. कौन से opposite? Of sameness and difference, of the general and the concrete, the idea with the image, the individual with the representative, that is type, the sense of novelty and freshness with old and familiar objects, a more than usual state of emotions with more than usual order. There is an extra emotive charge to the poetry, and there is more rigorous order to the words and phrases. Judgment ever awake and steady self-possession. And what it does, it blends and harmonizes the natural and the artificial. Still subordinate art to nature, manner to matter. So art becomes subordinate to nature. Manner becomes subordinate to matter. And our admiration of the poet to our sympathy with poetry. And you can see all these opposites being reconciled. Who does it do you think it reminds you of? कहीं पे आता है opposite qualities being reconciled?
Yes.
कहाँ पे आता है? Yes, Shatabdi.
Sir, I was thinking of something else. I mean, like, the language reminds me of somehow Oscar Wilde's dramas.
Okay. Yeah.
जैसे तू जेरोक्स करा दे
Okay. Yeah.
10 मिनट में क्या पहुंचवा
हाँ, वो तो ready. अच्छा आपने नहीं है
हां पास नहीं जाए
Thanks a lot. No, it is about Hegel that I was thinking of, right? The opposite qualities being reconciled. Yes. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop here for now. Yes, the dialectical relation and negation and sublation of the opposites, right? To higher unity. याद आ गया? Higher form of mediated unity. Very good, very good. Okay, so we'll continue little bit of Coleridge that is left tomorrow, and we'll start another topic. Till then, you have to read and come tomorrow, right? So that if you have doubts and questions, you can take that. Okay, so we stop for now. And have a good day, and please take care of yourself. So, see you tomorrow.